This is Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative. Today we're joined by Professor Michael Geist, the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law at the University of Ottawa.
Thanks so much for joining me, Professor.
Yeah, no, happy to.
Okay, so for those who don't know your background, you're the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law at the University of Ottawa, which is where I went to school. Definitely not in that topic, but love that school. What kind of issues do you focus on in this role? Because it's a pretty big title.
It is a pretty broad title, and the kind of issues I focus on are pretty broad as well. I sometimes tell people that I'm sort of at the intersection between law, technology, and policy, which is fitting being in Ottawa for sure. And there's obviously a significant tech presence as well. So you're able to draw both on the presence of technology sector and then, of course, government. And so public policy plays a pretty big role. And I cover pretty much the waterfront between internet regulation, e-commerce, of course, intellectual property issues like copyright. There's quite a lot on privacy. Now, broadcast regulation, online harms. Seems like there's just this never-ending list of issues.
How long have you been in this role? Because I feel like things have changed over the time since you probably took on this role in the first place.
Yeah, that's true. No, I've been a long time. I've had a Canada Research Chair at this point almost as long as you can have one, to be honest. I'm been so fortunate because there's both the system with tier ones and tier twos. And so I've been at the University of Ottawa for, I think it's 27 years, and I've had a Canada Research Chair for, I think it's like 23. So it's a pretty long period of time.
This is part of my excitement for having you on the podcast because, like you said, you do cover a whole lot of different topics and you have quite a bit of experience in this field. So I think you were kind of the person to talk to this week, as a number of different pieces of the government's agenda around digital and law and all these other things are coming out. So the first thing I want to talk about is digital bans, because I think that has been the primary focus of, I guess you could say, the online discourse from parents and other concerned folks over the last couple of years, not just in Canada, of course, around the world. So parents want to protect their kids. I think that's entirely reasonable, but there's questions about what's the best way to go about doing that. There's been a lot of political pressure we've seen just across the globe. Australia is usually the incubator. I know they have been for other things over the last 25 years when it comes to digital access to things and children. The Carney government is expected to reintroduce the Online Harms Act, which is something that's kind of been bounced around in government and on Parliament Hill for a while. This time it's expected to probably include a social media ban for kids under 16. In your expert opinion, how much do these kind of bans help to address underlying safety concerns, and how effective have they been elsewhere?
Yeah, no, so that is the topic of the moment as we record this. The government's expected to introduce that legislation tomorrow. It'll be called, I believe, the Digital Safety Act this time around rather than the Online Harms Act, but some of the substance will in all likelihood be quite similar, but one of the big additions is this notion of a social media ban for kids under the age of 16. I think it's a terrible idea. It's bad policy. It is ineffective. It creates its own set of harms along the way. And none of that is to suggest that there isn't a role for regulation of social media companies. There absolutely is. But the notion that somehow those needs disappear when someone turns 17 is it's kind of ridiculous. The reality is the concerns that arise around privacy, around some of the algorithmic related issues related to bias. I mean, there's obviously a pretty long list of concerns that have arisen in the context of social media. These, I think, are society-wide concerns, and they deserve effective regulation across the board. Targeting just kids both has proven ineffective, at least so far. You mentioned Australia being the incubator for this, and you're right. Australia has had a system like this in place for about five months, soon 6 months. And at least the initial data that came out was that it had not proven effective, that a pretty small percentage of users were off social media altogether. There was no real decline in cyberbullying claims. And I was actually at a recent event with an Australian academic who focuses on these issues. And she said that not only is there a whole lot of circumvention taking place by those that would be targeted by the ban, but this is increasingly unpopular with parents as well, as they've actually had their rights effectively removed and they find their kids still going online and sometimes going to less regulated spaces. So there's actually higher risks when you bring this in. And on top of all of that, this kind of system has the effect of requiring everybody to provide some sort of identification, right? If you set up a system that say we're going to exclude a certain set of users, those 16 and under, the effect is to say that everybody has to provide some sort of identification. So government is quite literally moving towards a system where tens of millions of Canadians would be required to provide identification to, post a picture on Facebook or a video on YouTube.
I want to break out a couple things there. One is, first and foremost, the kids, because when you set up these systems that make it harder for kids to go online, as you said, it's proven ineffective. They still find ways to go online. But what that actually does is harm the trust between them and, say, their parents or other people they might be able to go to if they weren't breaking a rule already. And I have huge concerns about creating, first of all, it's putting the onus on individual people as opposed to these platforms, which you've mentioned. But second of all, it does create this environment where kids aren't as likely to go to their parents if something happens on the internet that is unsafe for them. How much concern do you have about that? Because I think it sort of puts some of these harms a bit more underground than they might be, and that can harm kids even more.
Yeah, I think it does do that. Listen, there are a lot of problems with some of the big social media companies, to be sure. But as bad as they might be, they are at least more responsive than some of the services that are a bit more underground that try to escape regulation. And they are at least the ones that are going to play by the rules. They're going to fight against some of these rules, to be sure. But once the rules are set up, for the most part, they're going to comply if so long as comply. Some people might not like how they comply, but they're still going to look to comply. The Online News Act would be a good example of that. But in this instance, I think you're right. I think this does have the effect of treating going on social media for kids as sort of this illicit activity. I mean, I guess it supposedly is if we pass something like this. And so then kids are likely to sort of in some ways try to hide what takes place unless they've got parents that say this is ridiculous and actively find ways to help them circumvent, which is reports out of Australia suggest that's one of the things that's happening as well.
I do want to talk about that privacy piece as well, because as soon as you start to have these verification requirements, that means something for everybody else. And I don't think people think about that when they propose these solutions. I think they think, oh, yeah, it'll just be like the kids have to test. And it's like, well, no, this does mean everybody has to go through that process. And there's already there's so little trust in these platforms anyway because of the big behaviors they have conducted and with our elections and other things like that in the past. What that actually looked like and what does that mean for personal privacy? Because there's always these promises of, okay, you upload your ID, but then we'll delete it right away. And we know these platforms have been shady in the past. What would that actually look like?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, the implementation is enormously problematic because it involves some mechanism to get people's age to verify that they are of a certain age so that they are entitled to use or create accounts on social media. Now, at least at the moment, this largely unfolds in two different ways, both of which raise serious issues. One is what's known as age verification technologies that basically require someone to upload government-issued ID, and then there's an attempt to match it with the face to ensure that the ID is the one that belongs to the individual. That creates huge privacy risks on its own, right? Suddenly we've got millions of Canadians uploading their ID to third-party services. It probably won't be to the social media companies themselves. It'll go to third-party services. As far as I know, none of them are located in Canada. So we've got questions as to whether or not Canadian privacy law will even apply to any of this. And it becomes a potential target, obviously, for security breaches. And we've seen that play out before. The alternative, when people say, well, okay, fine, let's find an alternative where you don't have to upload your ID, is using what's known as age estimation technology, where the system will take a look at the person in front of the computer screen and guess at their age using some sort of algorithm. There are lots of problems with the system too. Some will be obvious to your listeners. The idea that somehow an algorithm is going to be any better than a human at distinguishing between a 16-year-old and a 17-year-old is absurd. I mean, most people themselves could walk into a high school classroom and have a hard time figuring out the precise age of an individual such that you'd be in a position to make this kind of decision. But beyond that, because this system is not very accurate, there is a tendency then to say, okay, the system has to dig deeper to make this guess. So it then goes into looking, well, who are this person's friends? How old are they? What kind of language do they use? What sort of sites do they visit? In other words, they engage in a whole host of surveillance of the individual in an effort to try to estimate their age, which itself, of course, raises problems. And then even on top of all that, the age estimation works particularly poorly for people with darker toned skins. There's less light in the picture is what happens. And so that means that you introduce racial bias into these systems, because suddenly those that are darker in skin tone are more likely to face this more invasive surveillance, because the system has a harder time estimating how old they are. Both systems are not fit for purpose, at least right now. Scientific experts from around the world have urged governments to put a moratorium on using these kinds of technologies until they get better. And yet the government just seems to march ahead without any real concern for what implementation of these kinds of rules would actually mean.
Well, one thing I do want to ask about too is options for safeguards. So when I think about all these issues that people are raising about the usage of social media platforms by kids, I think a lot of those apply to seniors, to millennials, to any age group. We have addictions to these systems and platforms that we aren't addressing society wide. And I don't know that just banning children is the solution to solving that problem, especially since once they turn 17, they're dumped back into the system with no preparation for it. What are some of the actual options instead of enforcing like a surveillance-based process? What are some of the options for safeguards? You've talked about a legislative framework where we actually impose these requirements on the platforms themselves. What does that look like to responsibly manage digital platforms?
Well, you've used the right word. Responsibility is, I think, where a lot of the focus is. And so there's the last online harms bill included what was known as a duty to act responsibly. And, it fleshed out some of the details of what that might look like: digital safety plans, real liability for failing to meet some of that, setting some minimum standards about what some of that might look like. I expect that we will see the government reintroduce either that concept or a concept that's pretty similar in the forthcoming bill. And I think that's the starting point. So you can get into that. You can then get into design related issues to ensure that some of the design and some of the kind of functionality that exists is more age appropriate. And the like. So there's a lot of different things that can be done. There could be more transparency, and at the end of the day, there can be liability for failing to live up to, at a minimum, the commitments that many of these companies make. You do that, and you have the effect of, I think, providing benefits for all. And I should note, I mean, you highlighted the concerns that exist not only for younger users, but some older users as well. We should be clear: the data on the harms associated with social media is far more mixed than is often suggested. And so much of the science tells us that there is a segment of users that for which there are real harms, no question, and we ought to ensure that we try to provide appropriate protections. There are also a segment of users, though, where social media is enormously beneficial in this age group. We had at one event I was at literally just last night. Well, someone got up and talked about Greta Thunberg and said, she did all of her initial advocacy as a kid under this system. So would she have been blocked out from social media? She would have been under this kind of system. And we can think a lot of people that had impact at younger ages, and social media played a pretty important role. The idea that they would be excluded from that world, I think, would strike us as pretty problematic. And then, so you've got, a segment where there's a concern, there's a segment where there are real benefits. And then you've got, frankly, the vast majority of users for whom the data is pretty mixed. I mean, it's marginally moves in one direction or another, and social media is not even close to being the primary concern that arises, even amongst the issues that might arise with respect to digital technologies and the like. And so the truth is, there is, I think, as Sarah Grimes, a professor at McGill, has talked about, a bit of a moral panic here, where there is this rush to regulate. There's a couple books, or at least one book in particular, Jonathan Haidt's book, that has, I think, sparked a lot of this. But when you drill down into the science, it isn't as convincing as some would have you believe. And when you look at the solutions themselves, they're far worse than many of the proponents would admit.
I'm glad you brought up Jonathan Haidt's book, because I think that really has stirred a moral panic. And his research was called out in Nature for cherry picking data and really extrapolating answers that were not based in the data that was collected. And this has been actually a historic problem with some of his work in the past. And this isn't even his field of expertise. Of course, this is something that he sort of landed into, and then it became very viral. And I have a lot of parents who talk to me about this book, and then I talk to them about some of the problems in this book. And I do think it's very similar to some of the moral panics we've seen in the 80s and the 50s around other topics. And it just becomes this steamrolling thing. And of course, the internet helps spread it as well, because it is very viral. But I think very few people know, as you were pointing out, that the data is simply not there to say these things. We saw this during the pandemic too, right? You closed schools, and a lot of folks were very concerned that the mental health of kids would worsen. And we saw the data afterwards, and it did not. So there's a lot of assumptions that get made from people's own personal experiences that is just not reflected in the data. Given that, how do you think the government should approach some of these discussions going forward? Because you do have to manage public opinion, but I think we also should create policy based on actual science and data.
Yeah, no, I think that's true, and I think the government, at least with its current plan, is failing to level with parents. I think that they are responding to some of this panic and saying, "Okay, we got your back. Here's what we're going to do," and then for those who are concerned, and saying, "Don't worry, this is temporary." But the reality is, it's not temporary. As I've written, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube in this context, and I think that that's just the reality here. Once you set up the infrastructure for this kind of ID system, the idea that somehow you're just going to flick a switch and turn it all off strikes me as incredibly unlikely. And it's the notion that you're telling parents, well, okay, we got your back and we're going to get this done quickly. Well, take a look at other digital policies that the government has introduced under similar notions of we've got to move quickly and address some of these issues. And the reality is that it takes years to implement in some instances. The Online Streaming Act that's attracted attention the last few days as the government has backtracked on it. That was introduced in 2020. And so here we are almost 6 years later, 5.5 years from when the bill was first introduced. And the government's hit the reset button on one of the core elements of that bill. It's going to take several more years. Well, back then, I can remember the heritage minister talking about $1 billion to the sector within 8 months. And so, it is madness to tell people that somehow we're going to get this done super quickly, even with a majority government. We've seen how this plays out. And in this context in particular, getting it passed is only the very start of the battle. In this case, they're actually talking about standing up a whole digital safety commission. Well, the ability to get all of that done and get someone in place and set standards and have all of this working, frankly, before the end of their term, strikes me as pretty challenging.
Do you think this is something that the government should have been able to predict a little better? Because I do take your point. Things take a while to put in place in government. I think people think you can just wave your wand and regulations exist, and that's not how anything works. But there also seems to be a real lack of foresight. And I know some of these things can't be predicted because the technology is moving so quickly. But I also know that some of the things we're putting in place now are not necessarily going to be responsive to where the technology is in 8 months, in 10 months, 3 years. What does the government need to be doing to actually start forecasting some of these things so that we're not constantly falling behind actual progress in the sector?
Yeah, I must admit, I don't know that it can sort of provide an adequate response to what you just asked. I think back to the Online News Act, where which I was also quite vocal on, and I argue that it was a mistake. This was the law that required two platforms, Facebook or Meta and Google, to pay for linking to news. That's why we still don't have links to news in Canada on the Meta platforms almost full 3 years now since this took effect. And leaving aside that this was, I think, a mistake really from the beginning, I recall I wrote a piece in the Globe just towards the end of that process saying, listen, AI is not even mentioned in this bill. And it's pretty clear that, in the sort of the Wayne Gretzky parlance, that's where the puck is going. And so you ought to be focused on this. It's crazy that we're putting forward a bill that's really focused on yesterday's solutions. So in an ideal world, you'd have government could anticipate. There are some dangers, I will say, with sort of what might be seen as anticipatory regulation, let's say, in this area. Sometimes technology doesn't work out in the way we thought. Sometimes the harms themselves are not what we thought they would be. And so it's just as easy to get some of those things wrong. So I certainly wouldn't want to be advocating for trying to get ahead of the game by just saying, okay, I'm the government and I'm here to regulate, not just now, but for future stuff too. But I think fundamentally the best way to future proof, recognizing that it's pretty tough to do that, is to identify, well, what are the core principles you're trying to achieve here, and try to ensure that the legislation is flexible enough to implement some of those principles, regardless of what the technology happens to be. And it's not always easy. It still may be the case that the law over time becomes outdated. But nevertheless, it may still, I think, have some of the flexibility that you're looking for to try to address the issue. Privacy is probably the best example of that, where we desperately need an update to our privacy law, but it's now more than 25 years old. And so many of the kinds of issues that arise today didn't really exist at the time that law was passed. But it is a principles-based piece of legislation that the Privacy Commissioner and others have been able to try to interpret around some of these issues. And that strikes me as a better approach than a narrowly tailored technology-specific approach that, given the kind of timelines that we have around legislating, are oftentimes sort of basically expired before they even arrive as legislation.
So we've talked a little bit about surveillance, and we've talked just now a little bit about privacy. There's a really important piece of legislation making its way through Parliament right now. They're actually going to be discussing it today, later this afternoon, at the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security, where you have actually appeared as a witness to also discuss this piece of legislation. So this is Bill C-22. It's the government's lawful access legislation. Can you talk about what this bill is all about and what it's meant to do?
I can start by saying, well, what it's meant to do is, at least for proponents, will tell you that it is meant to provide law enforcement, and that's broadly defined to include both, your typical local police as well as securities agencies, signals intelligence agencies. So it's pretty broad ranging, to provide them with the tools they need to address criminal activity, especially in the digital environment. And so their arguments are that our existing laws are out of date. Sounds familiar, and it's in need of an update. The truth is, there have been updates over the years to address some of these kinds of issues. There have also been problems with some of the updates or rules that have been put into place. So the Supreme Court of Canada has now, on at least a couple of occasions, reviewed some of the prospect of providing access to, let's say, subscriber information to law enforcement coming from, let's say, an internet provider. And they have found that the approach has violated people's reasonable expectation of privacy, violating our charter rights. So these are not easy issues to navigate because we have privacy rights. So part of what you're trying to do with this is striking a balance between the rights of privacy on the one hand and providing the necessary tools and oversight for what takes place from a law enforcement side. As long as I've been doing this, we talked off the top about how long I've been doing this. Lawful access has been one of those issues that's been there. I mean, it like literally goes back decades, and doesn't matter what the government is, whether liberal or conservative. There are pressures that come from public safety or Department of Justice on behalf of those law enforcement agencies for these kinds of tools or powers: access to subscriber information, access to their networks, the ability to gain access to messages or activity that might be encrypted. Those are the kinds of things they want. There is invariably pushback, and questions often come up. Well, how much oversight is there? What are the risks that you're introducing if you put this into place? And so now we have Bill C-22, which I guess is worth noting is the successor to Bill C-2, which the government introduced almost as soon as it was elected, and raised enormous concerns about warrantless access to subscriber information, not just from internet providers, but literally anyone providing a service in Canada. It was astonishing. It was like, go to a hotel or a car rental company or your hairstylist. All of them could be subject to this legislation. And so that raised a lot of concerns. The government went back to the drawing board on that issue. But on the issue that really speaks to the interactions between law enforcement and especially internet providers, but it's even more than that, is communications or electronic service providers. They didn't make any changes. In fact, they added to it. And that's where there has been a ton of concern about what it means for privacy, whether or not some of these companies can even continue to operate in Canada if the government goes ahead as is.
So I want to break out the two parts of that. The first part is the subscriber data. So essentially, one of the big sticking points is metadata retention. So one of the goals of the legislation is to make it a mandatory requirement on digital providers, which again, as you mentioned, could be your internet provider, your cell phone provider, your cell tower provider, whatever it is, to collect and retain metadata from all subscribers for up to 1 year. So you've warned, and I think correctly, that this would create a comprehensive surveillance map of every Canadian. How serious is the threat to our privacy rights? Because I think it sounds pretty serious.
I think it's hugely serious, and it is worth emphasizing that that was not included in the initial bill back, that C2 bill. So even when they went back to the drawing board and consulted with lots of different people, and I had the chance to speak to the Murray Rankin, who the government tabbed with leading that consultation, metadata didn't come up because it wasn't part of the first bill. This idea of requiring providers to keep all this data for up to a year is, as I say, hugely problematic. And people should understand what we're talking about with metadata. We are not talking about the content of a message, which the government always says, listen, we're not talking about looking at your content. We don't care what you say in the email, but it's everything around that, which can be very revealing, right? So it is, if we think about how we move around typically with our devices all the time, that's our location. That's who we communicate with. That's when we communicate. That's what we communicate with. All of that is there for a year. It's building really this massive haystack with the prospect that maybe one day you'll need the needle for one particular person. But everybody, with 99.999% of people having done nothing wrong and having no reason to have this data retained in this way, all of this data gets retained and collected. The government is fond of saying we're just trying to catch up with sort of our so-called Five Eyes partners, some of our allies on this issue. The U.S. does not have this in place. European courts have struck this down, or this kind of approach, as being disproportionate. It is frankly stunning to see the government pushing ahead with this. And I'll close just by noting that, there have been suggestions for potential changes and amendments to try to strike a more reasonable balance. And one of the questions that often comes up is to ask law enforcement, well, what's the use case here? Why do you need all of this information collected? And they have not provided, at least in my view, an effective response to why, not necessarily why metadata, but why metadata for a year, right? So they will talk about the examples they give. We'll say, listen, sometimes it may take even 30 days or something like that before an investigation gets going. And we don't know what we don't know. And so we need access to that information. But no one has provided an example that tells us why you need this for a year. 30 days, 30 days. If you're at that point, you've stood up an investigation, you can go to court and get a court order to retain metadata on a particular individual. So you don't need it on everybody for a year. And they've never provided an example of when that would arise. And further, the other use case they provide as well, if there's a violent incident, we want to be able to know where, all the bystanders, all the people who are around there. Well, that's exactly the concern. I mean, they're quite literally saying we want to have this kind of surveillance map to know where people were at any given time. And, they see it as a feature, and I guess I see it as a bug.
I've seen coverage of this issue, and the government's essentially said, oh, this isn't a big deal. It's a minor data collecting exercise. It's similar to compiling an old phone book. This is just a modern version of it. But tech companies, and I'm always concerned when tech companies are concerned because they're not typically the most concerned group of people about these types of things. But you have Signal, you have DuckDuckGo. They're already threatening to pull out of Canada rather than comply with this legislation because they claim that it would break encryption. And for organizations like that, encryption is their bread and butter. It is their reason for existing as a company. Who's right?
Oh, I think the companies are in this case, no question. And to be clear, the attempts to paint this as just a bluff or something like that, you just talk, but you'll fall into line when the issue really comes up. I don't think it's true. And we saw that with the Online News Act. In this instance, for some of these companies, the encryption and the lack of keeping logs, so no retention of metadata, is the product. right? So if you turn around and say, well, no, you have to provide a backdoor, and do it secretly, by the way, you're not allowed to disclose that you're doing any of this, or retain metadata. That's not their, if you're a VPN, that's just not your service. And so you can't continue to operate or at least be based in Canada if those are the requirements you face. We have seen this movie in other countries. Apple is a perfect example. So it's not just VPNs. Apple had, at one point had to remove one of its advanced data protection services that they offered to users because the UK had insisted that they wanted to have similar kinds of access. And so they said, listen, you can ask for it, but if that's the case, we can't provide this service to our users. We're not going to go down that road. So these are real risks in terms of the services that might operate in Canada. And again, to emphasize, I don't really think there has been a really good evidence base case made for why this is necessary. And in fact, when the encryption issue comes up and the companies have raised this, the government, as you say, is sought to downplay it. They say, oh, you're misreading the law. This is not really what we have in mind. And yet when law enforcement appears before committee, they quite literally say, we need access to encrypted data. And so it's pretty obvious what's taking place. In fact, the likely beneficiaries of this are pretty straightforward of this. In some ways, they're being more straightforward than the government has been.
So if this continues down that road, because again, we don't know where it will end up in committee and what the final legislation will look like before it's voted on. And at this point, I'm not sure that's going to happen before the summer anyway, but this is going to be an ongoing conversation. But the tech sector is paying attention to this. And I keep thinking about how this government in particular is very focused on tech and using that as a way to rebuild the economy and to make Canada a global player on these fronts. If this legislation passes, though, do you foresee a world where, without significant amendments, do you foresee a world where there is a massive risk that tech companies will actually pull out of the Canadian market and that will functionally digitally strand users in this country? I think if Apple were to get angry enough, could they basically pull out and then all of these iPhone users across the country are suddenly, left shit out of luck, more or less, in terms of how they want to keep using their devices as intended before all this legislation came forward? Is there a risk that there's going to be a tech exodus in Canada's digital economy?
Yes, but not, yes, there is. I don't know that it's necessarily the one you just described. I don't think iPhone users are going to be left high and dry without Apple.
I'm being hyperbolic, of course.
Yeah, no, I know. And I mentioned Apple earlier. So these companies do react, and I think that we would have companies like Apple react. I don't think that means we would see them exit the jurisdiction altogether, but it does mean that there may be certain services that they offer that they will not be able to offer in Canada. They'll say, listen, we can't offer it in Canada. That's clear. There are other services that have made clear that if required to meet these obligations, they would not be able to continue to operate in Canada. And I mentioned VPNs. Another good example is Signal, a very popular messaging service. And their position has been, we cannot and will not do with what government of Canada is looking for. And if that becomes a legal requirement, then we simply won't continue to offer the service in Canada.
The big conversation this week digitally, at least in the country, other than all these other topics, has been the AI strategy. So as we're speaking now, that came out last week, and people have really started digging into what it means. Before we get into the strategy, though, I want to talk about the sector in Canada at large. So it's been one of the success stories for Canada. We're a global hub for AI research and talent. We have created a lot of this infrastructure in the first place. But if you talk to people who are in this space, they don't think that it has really led to Canada having digital sovereignty in this space. We seem to create the talent and then it migrates to Silicon Valley or elsewhere. Why do you think we're failing to scale domestic AI champions and commercialize our own research within our country?
Well, I mean, that raises the very questions that the government's trying to find some answers to, right? And that's in some ways what the strategy is really all about. I think, well, I guess my view would be that there was no single answer to that. I think there are a number of different things that are at play. From a regulatory perspective, I'm not sure that that's the regulation's been the core element. I mean, we can get into things like data or digital sovereignty if you like, and that is to me, those to me are legal concepts where I think there are significant issues. Why don't we have giant champions? I mean, Cohere is often cited as the example or the notable Canadian exception to that, but still, it's fair to say that we have done better, I think, on the research side of AI as opposed to some of the commercialization side. Um, Part of it may be just some of the same kinds of problems we've seen in Canada or challenges we've seen in Canada in other areas. I mean, the same was true on lots of other e-commerce and digital related issues where you might get an exception to the rule. Shopify is an example, but many times some of the larger players, what become the larger players go elsewhere. Part of that's capital, that we just don't have the sort of kind of the capital to compete effectively in this space, which I think raises some questions about the government's plans and whether or not, it may be investing heavily from a government perspective, but viewed globally, this is still relatively small and may not move this as much in this way they had hoped. And I think that at the end of the day, the regulations, or at least government approach to this, has struggled to identify what exactly do we want to be when it comes to AI. Is the Canadian approach to AI about sort of safeguards and protections and sort of telling companies what they can't do? Or is it more enabling? And I recognize that, you could try to do both, but, if you compare the Canadian AI strategy with some of the stuff that we see from other, let's say, middle powers on this issue, they're all pretty similar. They're all focused on the fact that the large AI companies are not Canadian based for the most part, or domestic based for those other countries. And so they are thinking both about, well, how can we turn our country into a player, but then also how can we protect ourselves from some of those foreign players? In the United States, they are less concerned. They don't take that approach. They're quite literally talk about how can we dominate in this space. And so it's tough when your objectives differ in that way, I think.
So the strategy came out. I know you spent some time with it over the weekend to really dig into it. What are the core elements of this plan that the Carney government has put forward?
Well, there's lots there. I mean, governments themselves often tend to focus on spending. How much can we spend on these issues? And I don't think the public cares as much or is as easily impressed with it. But in the government world, how much you spend seems to be sort of the big way that you show that you are serious about all of this stuff. So they talk about some of the stuff that any number of different programs, and here's the thing they're spending on. I'll leave it to others to evaluate some of that spending. I guess I would say that the spending on a whole, as I hinted at earlier, is relatively small relative to global spend. Not relatively, it is tiny relative to global spend on AI. And so I'm not sure that it moves the needle as much as the government would like. I think there may be some investments or programs that are useful. I do think AI literacy is correlated to some of the kinds of concerns that people have out there and using these tools more effectively. And so I think there's some value there. I think some of the emphasis on health data is well placed. I think that's an area where Canada is positioned, given that we've got a public healthcare system, a a community that is just so broadly diverse and representative, that I think the health data that we are able to generate, and if we could put it to good use while providing appropriate safeguards, I think holds a lot of potential. And there's some discussion of public AI as a counter to some of these large companies. I think that's good as well. But as we've been talking, I'm a law prof. So when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When you're a law prof, everything looks like a legal issue. And in this instance, I think some of the core legal questions are still largely unanswered. Now, we may be getting quick answers to them because the emphasis from the government was to say we need to move both on the safety harms related issues and we need to move on privacy. They gave a few hints, but didn't give a lot of detail. As it turns out, they're moving fast. So within a week, they will be of the AI strategy. We'll get the online harms or digital safety piece, and as I understand it, although they haven't confirmed anything, after a week of that, just before the government rises and the House rises rather for the summer, they will introduce the privacy piece. But as it stands, at least in terms of trying to judge what we've got, the legal side feels a bit like a version 1.0, and you've got to wait a couple of weeks for the 2.0 version.
Element I do want to talk about is the feedback from public and from experts that went into the strategy in the first place, because the government said it got 11,000 public submissions, and it also had insights from a 28-member expert AI strategy task force. I want to know how much of that advice actually made it into the strategy, because I've worked in government, and I know often government starts out with what it wants to do and sometimes tries to shoehorn the feedback into that same frame. I know you had looked at a lot of the feedback, and I know you actually put it into AI as well, because famously the government used AI to review the feedback that it got on this and then made its assumptions based on that. What have you found in that regard? How reflective of actual public and expert feedback is this document?
Yeah. Okay. So to start, to note that sort of those posts looked at the government's kind of what we heard report back to the public, and on that front, when you looked at and used AI to support this, when you looked at what the government heard in its submissions, both from this group of experts that they'd assembled, who were then asked to provide memos, because the government had set all this up as this 30-day sprint to move quickly, although they ended up taking 6 months before they actually released the actual strategy. So they set this up as, we're moving quick, give us your thoughts, and then give the thoughts. I didn't think either of them, frankly, really provided all that. It was clear, to your point, that the government recited some of what they heard, but the points of emphasis where they tried to sort of highlight what the issues that were out there tended to suggest that they had a pretty good idea of what they were looking to do, and then were looking to basically justify what they had in mind based on the submissions, as opposed to significantly rethink. That said, it does seem to me that there have been shifts over the 6 months. So you take 6 months, especially in something like that moves as fast as AI, stuff's going to change, and stuff has changed. But what's changed is not the government's sort of openness to taking the consultation stuff they got back seriously. What changed are events, so to speak, right? So the Tumbler Ridge shooting was an event that sparked a lot of discussion around regulating AI chatbots, and I expect we will see regulation of AI chatbots when the digital safety plan comes out. The hate book and the growth around social media regulation and a social media ban was certainly not an issue. It's not even a direct AI issue, but there was even talk about banning AI chatbots in the same way. And all of that came after. So different issues have played differently at different times. And when I think back to the fall, digital sovereignty was one of the really big issues at the time. Is all anyone was, at least in my geeky world, all anyone was talking about. But digital sovereignty remains a pillar in this strategy, but whether or not the government has decided to act in quite the same way on some of these concerns, I would say they've de-emphasized it. So it does seem to me that things have changed, but they've changed not because of anything that came out of that consultation, but they came out of because of their other events that began really to shift a lot of the perspectives the government had. Just to quickly to note that on this Digital Safety Act or Online Harms Act, back at that time, all the discussion generally coming out of where Heritage and the government was going to go was that, by and large, they were going to reintroduce pretty much the same bill and exclude the parts that had proven to be very controversial from a speech perspective, involving things like the Criminal Code and Human Rights Act, and would go much more directly on that duty to act responsibly we were talking about before. Events happened, and suddenly you've got Mark Carney's wife, Diane, appearing on stage with Jonathan Haidt, and before you know it, we've got a social media ban for kids. And it's pretty clear that these were the influence levers that changed what we ended up with.
I do remember that. I was not impressed with that myself. I thought that was a pretty clear sign about where this was going to go. I do want to talk about the sort of trust and adoption pillars for a second in terms of the public, because to me, it almost seems like the goal here is adoption, and therefore we have to increase trust in order to get to adoption, as opposed to making these systems trustworthy and therefore encourage adoption from that front. part of the government's plan on this front is creating a national AI literacy initiative, largely targeting post-secondary students, but also targeting K-12 educators through public libraries. I've spent a lot of time looking at the Finland model in terms of disinformation. Again, disinformation, that word is referenced only once in the national AI strategy, which is very concerning to me. But in Finland, they do something called pre-bunking, which is where they teach kids as young as kindergarten level to recognize disinformation, to learn how to have good, basically online literacy skills. And they continue that up through into your senior years. And it is a real focus of the government's training of the public on digital tools. What do you think this training should actually include? And should it go broader than just, the school age level people?
Yeah, I guess I had a couple of things to say. First, yes, I think that this is not just a kids issue. I think that society-wide, we see this, I think, quite interesting disconnect that exists between public trust of AI and use of AI. And I guess I should also just backtrack for a sec, just to note that you're right to highlight adoption and use. That's really where the strategy is, and what much of what the strategy emphasizes. That's left some in the business community a bit frustrated. Their view is that we should be focusing on building AI as opposed to focusing so much on adoption, or at least be able to walk and chew gum at the same time and have both. So it is very much focused on that, but there is this interesting disconnect where people are distrustful of many polls suggest people are distrustful of AI, but they're using it. And in fact, even the notion that we are slow adopters isn't exactly right. The slow adoption is a reference to business adoption of AI. It is not a reference to the public's adoption of AI, which is hockey stick curve level fast in terms of how fast the public has moved towards using these AI services. So the rate of adoption is actually very high amongst the public. Businesses have been slower to adopt. That's a different issue, though, than going into schools to try to teach AI literacy or skills, right? So I do wonder a little bit about sort of some of the strategies that we've got here, both whether we've got the adoption problem the government, well, some would say whether the adoption is a problem at all, but even so, whether or not adoption is the problem that they are pointing it out to be, because business is not the same as users. And then if you are trying to deal with that, whether or not the approach they're taking is a good one. And it's hard to see how these particular solutions address slower levels of adoption in Canada, which tend to be more on the business side.
I'm glad you brought that up, because in the strategy, it talks about how 12% of Canadian businesses currently have adopted AI practices, and the goal is to get to 60% in the next 5 years. The goal is also to create hundreds of thousands of jobs, either directly in the AI industry or related to them, specifically for youth as well. There's a carve out for that. However, the feedback I've seen on this is that there's these targets that have been made, and there's some nice language about where we want to be, but there isn't much of a roadmap to get there. How feasible do you think these goals actually are?
Oh, I think they're just guessing, to be honest. And I think obviously it's useful to put targets. Do they really know what the employment numbers are going to be? Do they know what the net new employment is going to be? Of course not. This area is moving very, very quickly. The prospect that they really have any sort of genuine sense, I mean, strikes me as pretty unlikely. You can model stuff, and so I'm sure that they've got some sort of model that says this is how we landed on this number, but it's just a guess. 3 years ago, 4 years ago, we weren't even having this conversation in this way about AI, sort of pre-ChatGPT, and just take a look at how fast the space is moving. ChatGPT for many users has been passed over now by Anthropic's Claude, and Claude and ChatGPT and a number of other services are literally putting out new models and new features sometimes on a daily basis, definitely on a weekly basis. So the idea that we can project what things are going to look like in 5 years' time or in 10 years' time, I'm not so sure.
So we've talked a little bit about the safety pillar, and government, as you say, governments do love to commit an X number of dollars to something, and that means absolutely nothing to any normal person. It doesn't matter how much the money is. It's really meaningless. And we don't have a lot of details about what it's going to mean, but the government's committed to investing $50 million in the Canadian AI Safety Institute. what should that institute look like? What should its mandate be? Is that enough money to really get this going in a sector this large? What do you think about their approach on this pillar?
Yeah, no, I think they've already moved on the AI Safety Institute. This is more supplemental stuff because we are going to give them even more responsibility, so more money. There are a lot of different countries that have tried to move in this same area. So the AI Safety Institute sort of is designed to sort of say, well, what's Canada's position going to assist in? What's Canada's position globally? What can they do within the strategy? How can they address some of these other kinds of issues? There, of course, I think there is value in having some of that expertise at the table. There's a tendency to bring a particular lens to that, and as long as recognize that that's the lens they are bringing, then I suppose it's fine. But they've already sort of made moves in that area. It's an attempt, I think, to respond to the claim, well, government, you don't really know enough here, so okay, fine, we'll create someone that does, or an entity that does.
That is, the standard practice, I think. Just before we go, given all your expertise in this area and how closely you're paying attention to things, what high level advice would you give to your average Joe Canadian about adapting to this new digital age that we're finding ourselves in? What's your advice for just navigating everything that's coming at us right now?
Well, there's a policy side, and then there's just the everyday use side. On the everyday use side, honestly, just jump in. Look for some of the different tools that are out there. Sometimes the tools themselves are really useful in terms of trying to explain how they work and how they can be used and some of the shortcomings. And so it's important to come in with, or to try to gather some knowledge in terms of how you use these tools, where you ought to be skeptical, not creating a scenario where you're overly reliant. We're seeing a lot of that on the AI side, where someone comes in, they don't know anything, and suddenly they're relying on AI and reciting the stuff verbatim and not recognizing that notwithstanding the disclaimer at the bottom, that these services are prone to errors. So go in eyes wide open, but go in because the stuff is there and it's not going away, I don't think. On the policy side, which is easy for me to answer, I think people need to really open their eyes and get engaged, because the government is making some pretty profound decisions that will have big implications for people's privacy, for how these technologies are used. And there can be any number of different views, but it's important at least that those views be heard.
And just before we go, because you are an academic, but you're also somebody who makes these issues really accessible to the public, can you tell people where to go to find your Substack and what kind of stuff you write about?
Oh, yeah, sure. Thanks for that. So I try to put my stuff out in as many different ways as possible. So there is the Michael Geist Substack, I'm Geist. There's also my own blog, which has much the same kind of content at michaelgeist.ca. I've got a podcast called Law Bites that I put out most weeks that deals with some of these same kinds of issues, and I'm active on social media like Twitter and Blue Sky and the like at mgeist, MGEIST, and it covers the range of these kinds of things. So I attempt to be on pretty much on most of the platforms people would find themselves.
Fantastic. I think this has been, an incredible walkthrough of the digital landscape in Canada right now. These issues are very top of mind for a lot of people. So I appreciate you bringing it down to layman's terms and making this really accessible to folks. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian-owned company specializing in strategic communications, narrative development, and content creation. Our music today was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.